March 28, 1945. A damp cellar near the beleaguered town of Wiesel, Germany. The air is thick with the smell of wet concrete, stale sweat, and the bitter tang of ersatz coffee boiling over a sputtering camp stove. For 21-year-old Nachrichtenhelferin Gretel Wuber, this is the sound of the world ending. The incessant, rhythmic thump of distant artillery, a sound so constant it has become a part of her own heartbeat. Above, the sky is a canvas of gray smoke and the occasional, terrifying shriek of an American P-47 Thunderbolt. Her headset, cold against her ear, crackles with a chaotic symphony of desperation. Garbled reports of breakthroughs, phantom panzer divisions, and orders that contradict the ones from an hour ago. Her unit, a makeshift communications detachment for the remnants of the 1st Parachute Army, has been retreating for weeks. The fighting retreat has devolved into a panicked scramble. The men around her are no longer the confident soldiers of the newsreels. They are hollow-eyed boys and haggard old men of the Volkssturm, their uniforms a mix of faded Feldgrau and civilian coats. Gretel's own Luftwaffe gray uniform is stained with mud and grease, the smart eagle on her sleeve a mockery of the discipline that has utterly evaporated. Her commanding officer, Oberleutnant Vogel, paces the length of the cellar. His face is a mask of twitching paranoia, fueled by sleeplessness and Pervitin tablets. He sees traitors in every shadow, defeatism in every weary sigh. Just yesterday, he had a runner from the 116th Panzer Division shot for questioning an order to counterattack a bridge that no longer existed. The boy's body still lies by the barn, a stark warning to them all. Vogel stops, his gaze fixing on Gretel. Anything from Army Group H? Anything from command? His voice is a raw nerve. Gretel shakes her head, careful to keep her expression neutral. Static, Herr Oberleutnant. The lines north are cut. The Americans have crossed the Rhine in force. She omits the part she overheard from another channel. That the Americans weren't just across the river. They were everywhere. They were encircling the entire Ruhr, trapping hundreds of thousands of German soldiers in a vast cauldron. To speak such a truth in front of Vogel would be a death sentence. The generator powering their equipment sputters and dies. The sudden silence is more deafening than the shelling. A single light bulb flickers out, plunging the cellar into near darkness, illuminated only by the faint gray light filtering through a slit in foundation. In the quiet, you can hear a new sound. It's not the familiar crump of artillery. It's a low, mechanical grinding, a rhythmic clatter. It's the sound of steel treads on cobblestone, getting closer. It's the growl of a Sherman tank's Wright Continental engine, a sound they have all learned to dread. Vogel draws his Walter P-38 pistol, his hand trembling slightly. "To your positions! They will not take this cellar! Fight to the last woman!" he shrieks, his voice cracking. The old Volkssturm man by the stairs fumbles with his single-shot Panzerfaust, his hands shaking too badly to arm it. Another soldier, a boy no older than 16, begins to sob quietly in the corner, clutching his Mauser rifle as if it were a toy. Gretel looks from the terrified boy to the fanatical officer. The discipline, the order, the glorious Reich, it has all been boiled down to this: a madman with a pistol in a dark, wet hole in the ground, promising them a meaningless death. The grinding of the tank treads stops directly outside. Heavy footsteps crunch on the rubble overhead. A voice, amplified by a megaphone, bellows down in accented but clear German. "You are surrounded. Lay down your arms and come out with your hands in the air. You have 5 minutes." Gretel looks at her fellow Helferinnen, 2 other young women huddled by the radio set. Their faces are pale masks of terror, not of the Americans, but of Oberleutnant Vogel. He turns the pistol towards them, his eyes wild. "We die for the Führer!" he screams. But before he can act, the cellar door bursts inward in a shower of splintered wood, and the silhouettes of American soldiers, M1 Garand's leveled, fill the opening. The world has ended, and something new is about to begin. The American soldiers moved with a terrifying efficiency. They were not the degenerate beasts from the propaganda films. They were large, well-fed men in olive drab, their faces grim but not cruel. There was no hesitation. 2 GIs from the 79th Infantry Division pinned Oberleutnant Vogel against the damp cellar wall before he could raise his Walther. The pistol clattered to the floor. The rest of the soldiers fanned out, their movements practiced, their voices low and calm. Hands up. Hände hoch. On your feet. Slowly. Gretel rose, her hands held high, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected a shove, a curse, a rifle butt to the back. Instead, a young GI with freckles and startlingly blue eyes simply gestured with his rifle towards the splintered doorway. Out. Raus. The word was sharp, but his tone was devoid of the malice she had been conditioned to expect. The 16-year-old boy who had been sobbing dropped his rifle and stumbled forward, his hands clasped behind his head. No one shot him. No one screamed at him. They simply herded him and the others up the stairs and into the stark, gray light of a ruined world. The sheer scale of the American presence was staggering. Jeeps, trucks, and Sherman tanks clogged the narrow street. An endless column of soldiers marched past, their faces smudged with dirt, but their uniforms intact, their equipment seemingly brand new. They carried cigarettes, rations, ammunition. It was a vision of overwhelming, inexhaustible power. Gretel's unit had been sharing single tins of mystery meat for days, fighting over half loaves of stale black bread. These men had chocolate bars tucked into their helmet webbing. They were disarmed and searched with a detached professionalism. A female soldier, a WAC, was brought over to search Gretel and the other 2 women. She was firm but not rough, her hands patting down their coats and pockets for weapons. Gretel was terrified, waiting for the violation, the brutality that Dr. Goebbels had promised would befall any German woman captured by the enemy. It never came. They were simply lined up against a wall, their German world on one side, a completely unknown American one on the other. Oberleutnant Vogel was separated from them, bundled into a jeep with 2 MPs, his face a contorted mask of impotent rage. He was shouting about honor and betrayal, but no one seemed to be listening. The journey began, first in the back of a canvas-covered GMC truck, bouncing over pontoon bridges hastily thrown across the Rhine. The river, a sacred German artery, was now a highway for the enemy's conquest. At a sprawling collection point, they were processed. Their names, ranks, and units were recorded by clerks who seemed more bored than interested. They were given their first American meal, a C-ration tin of hash and a cracker that tasted like sawdust. But it was food. It was more than they had seen in days. They slept in a vast, muddy pen with thousands of other prisoners, the sky their only roof. From there, a train. The boxcars were crowded and smelled of unwashed bodies, but they were no worse than the German troop transports they had ridden to the front. The train rumbled through a shattered France, past towns and villages that bore the scars of the recent fighting. At Le Havre, they saw the ocean. For Gretel, who had never seen a body of water larger than the Rhine, it was like looking at the end of the earth. They were marched up the gangplank of a Liberty ship, a gray, ugly vessel built for cargo, not people. The Atlantic crossing was a 2-week purgatory of seasickness and uncertainty. Hundreds of women were packed into cavernous holds, swaying in hammocks strung 3 deep. The air was foul, the food was monotonous, but the guards were correct, almost distant. There was no fraternization, but there was also no cruelty. A medic treated a woman's infected leg with penicillin, a wonder drug Gretel had only heard about in whispers. Day after day, there was nothing but the gray, heaving water and the deep, throbbing pulse of the ship's engines, carrying them further and further from everything they had ever known. When they finally saw land, a hazy silhouette on the horizon, a strange mixture of dread and exhausted relief settled over the hold. This was it, America, the land of gangsters and cowboys, of mongrel races and moral decay. The ship docked, and the heavy doors to the hold groaned open, flooding the space with brilliant, clean light. They were herded onto another train, the windows blacked out. For days they traveled, the rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels a constant hypnotic drumbeat. Then, one morning, the train slowed, hissed to a stop, and the door slid open. A blast of cold, clean air smelling of pine and damp earth filled the car. A sign on the platform read, "Camp McCoy." The air in Wisconsin was different. It was crisp and sharp, so clean it felt alien in Gretel's lungs, a stark contrast to the perpetual smoke and cordite haze of the front. Stepping off the train at Camp McCoy was like stepping into another dimension. Gone were the rubble-strewn streets and the skeletal remains of bombed-out buildings. Here, there were neat rows of wooden barracks, painted a uniform, tidy brown. Gravel paths ran between them in straight geometric lines. In the distance, rolling hills were covered in a dense forest of pine trees, their green a shocking, vibrant color. There was no chaos. There was only an immense, unnerving sense of order. The process began immediately, and it was unlike anything she had ever experienced. They were marched not to a muddy pen, but to a large reception building. The first stop was delousing. Gretel braced herself for humiliation, for rough hands and jeering guards. Instead, American wax directed them through the process with a clinical, almost bored efficiency. They were instructed to undress, shower with strong-smelling soap under streams of blessedly hot water, and dust themselves with a white powder. It was impersonal, methodical, and strangely dignifying. For the first time in months, she felt clean. After the showers, they were not given back their filthy, lice-infested uniforms. Instead, they were handed new clothes. They were surplus U.S. Army fatigues, dyed a deep blue to mark them as prisoners of war. On the back of the shirts and on the trouser legs were the large white letters, PW. The clothes were coarse and ill-fitting, but they were whole. They had no reps, no bloodstains, no lingering smell of fear. They were also given 2 sets of undergarments, socks, and a pair of sturdy work shoes. The sheer quantity of it was bewildering. Back in Germany, civilians were mending clothes that were already threadbare, and soldiers fought in uniforms held together by hope and desperation. Here, the enemy gave their prisoners better clothing than their own troops possessed at the end. Next came the medical inspection. A team of doctors and nurses examined each woman. They looked at their teeth, listened to their lungs, checked them for signs of malnutrition and disease. A nurse with a kind face and tired eyes noticed a festering cut on Gretel's hand, a small injury from a piece of shrapnel she had long ignored. Without a word, the nurse cleaned it, applied a foul-smelling but soothing antiseptic, and wrapped it in a clean white bandage. Gretel stared at her wrapped hand, a lump forming in her throat. She couldn't remember the last time a wound had been treated with such care, without the urgency of patching up a soldier to be sent back into the meat grinder. This wasn't battlefield triage, this was health care. Finally, they were assigned to their barracks. Gretel stepped inside Barrack 27B and stopped, momentarily stunned. It was a long, simple wooden building, but it was immaculate. The wooden floors were swept clean. 20 metal-framed cots were arranged in a perfect row, each one made up with 2 wool blankets, a pillow, and a clean white sheet folded neatly at the foot. A pot-bellied stove stood in the center, radiating a gentle warmth against the Wisconsin chill. At the end of the building was a washroom with running water and flush toilets. Flush toilets! It seemed like the height of impossible luxury. Her assigned cot was by a window that looked out onto the compound. She could see the high barbed wire fences and the guard towers, stark reminders of her status. She was a prisoner, thousands of miles from home, her country in ruins, her future a complete void. And yet, as she sat on the edge of the cot, feeling the firm mattress beneath her, a deeply unsettling thought began to take root in her mind. This clean bed, the hot shower, the medical care, the sturdy clothes, this single hour as a prisoner of the Americans had been more orderly, more humane, and more dignifying than her last 6 months serving the Third Reich. The confusion was a physical ache in her chest. She had been prepared for hatred, for cruelty, for a fight for survival. She was not prepared for this disciplined, structured, and incomprehensible kindness. A loud bell rang across the compound, signaling the evening meal. The shock was just beginning. The mess hall was another assault on Gretel's senses. It was a vast, noisy space, but the noise was of clattering trays and conversation, not artillery. The smell was of baked bread, stewing meat, and strong, real coffee, not the foul, roasted acorn substitute she'd been drinking for years. The women filed past a serving line, and American cooks, large men in white aprons, slopped food onto their metal trays without ceremony, but with generous hands. There was beef stew with potatoes and carrots, thick slices of white bread with margarine, a baked apple for dessert, and a steaming mug of coffee with real milk and sugar. Gretel sat at a long wooden table with other women from her barracks. They ate in a stunned, almost reverent silence at first. The food was simple, institutional fare, but to them, it was a feast. It was hot, it was plentiful, there was meat in the stew. Gretel watched a woman named Ilse, who had been a Luftwaffe plotter in France, take a bite of the white bread and begin to weep silently, her shoulders shaking. No one said a word. They all understood. This simple act of being fed a full, nutritious meal felt like a betrayal of their own suffering and a profound indictment of the leaders who had starved them while promising a glorious victory. The days at Fort McCoy settled into a structured, predictable routine that was the absolute antithesis of the chaotic disintegration they had left behind. A bell woke them at 6. Breakfast was at 6:30. At 8, they reported for work details. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, they could be put to work in non-military jobs. Many of the women worked in the camp's massive laundry facilities, in the kitchens, or on the farm, tending crops. The work was monotonous, but it was not backbreaking. The guards who oversaw them were GIs who were often bored and homesick, not fanatical ideologues. They enforced the rules, but they did so with a weary professionalism. One afternoon, while working in the fields, Gretel saw a young guard, barely older than her, drop a Hershey's chocolate bar. He walked on, not noticing. Before she could stop herself, another prisoner, a former secretary from Berlin named Anya, scurried over and snatched it up. The guard turned, saw her, and his hand went to the M1 rifle slung over his shoulder. Anya froze, her face white with terror, clutching the forbidden prize. Gretel held her breath, expecting a shout, a blow, a report for insubordination. The guard just sighed. He looked at Anya's terrified face, then shook his head. "Keep it," he said in English, then waved a dismissive hand and walked away. Anya returned to the group, her hands trembling as she broke the chocolate into tiny pieces to share. It was a small gesture, but it was seismic, an act of casual, thoughtless humanity. The discipline of the American camp was not the discipline of fear Gretel had known. The German discipline was enforced by the pistol of an officer, by the threat of the Gestapo, by the fear of being branded a traitor. It was a brittle, hysterical discipline that shattered under pressure. The American discipline was systemic. It was in the schedules, the logistics, the supply chains that delivered food and clean linens and medical supplies without fail. It was the discipline of a nation so powerful and well-organized that it could afford to treat its enemies with a baseline of human decency, because it was simply the most efficient way to manage them. One evening, sitting on her cot, Gretel was talking quietly with Ilse. They were mending their blue PW shirts, a task that felt familiar and comforting. Ilse had been quiet and withdrawn since their arrival, the trauma of her capture near Normandy still fresh. "It's the order I cannot understand," Ilse whispered, not looking up from her needle. "Everything has a time. The meals, the work, the lockdown. The guards don't scream. The doctors give us medicine. They treat us better than our own officers did at the end." The words hung in the air between them, a shocking, undeniable truth. Gretel looked down at her own hands, at the neatly healed cut, the faint white scar a souvenir of a stranger's care. Better than Oberleutnant Vogel, who would have shot them for a moment of weakness. Better than the commanders who sent them into a hopeless battle with no food and no ammunition. Better than a system that had demanded their absolute sacrifice and then abandoned them to chaos, starvation, and death. The realization was not a comfort. It was a profound and deeply painful disorientation, a dismantling of her entire world. She was a prisoner, an enemy of this nation, and for the first time in a long time, she was safe. The contradiction was a weight that settled deep in her soul, heavy and immovable. In early May 1945, the news filtered into the camp. It came first as rumors whispered between prisoners, then as official announcements read out by the camp commandant over a crackling loudspeaker. Germany had surrendered. The Führer was dead. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and ended in unconditional defeat and utter ruin. For the women in Barrack 27B, the news was met not with loud grief or patriotic anger, but with a strange, hollow silence. The war had been over for them the moment they stepped onto the Liberty ship, but this was a final, irrevocable end. They were now prisoners of a victorious enemy and citizens of a nation that no longer truly existed. The structured routine of Fort McCoy continued, a bizarre island of predictability in a world turned upside down. But the atmosphere had changed. The uncertainty of their personal fates now loomed larger than the daily schedule. What would happen to them? When would they go home? And more terrifyingly, what home was there to go back to? Letters began to arrive, heavily censored, but still carrying devastating glimpses of the reality in Germany. Gretel received a letter from an aunt in Cologne. Her parents' apartment building in Berlin had been bombed flat. There was no word on their fate. The city was a wasteland, divided among the victors. People were starving. Millions were homeless. The letter was written on a scrap of paper, the ink smudged, the words painting a picture of an apocalyptic landscape that seemed a universe away from the green hills of Wisconsin. Reading it, Gretel felt a wave of guilt so powerful it made her dizzy. She was here, in a clean barracks, eating 3 meals a day, while her family and her people were picking through rubble for scraps of food. Her safety felt like a curse. The American authorities began a program of re-education. The women were shown films of the liberation of concentration camps, like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. They sat in stunned, horrified silence in a makeshift theater as flickering black and white images filled the screen. Skeletal figures in striped pajamas, piles of emaciated bodies being pushed into mass graves by bulldozers. At first, many whispered that it was propaganda, clever fakes, like the ones their own ministry had produced. But the images were too raw, too visceral, too brutally real to be dismissed. Gretel watched, her stomach churning. She had served that regime. She had worn its uniform, relayed its orders, and believed, at least in the beginning, in its cause. She had never known about this. Or perhaps she had chosen not to know, not to ask questions, not to look too closely at the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of their nationalist fervor. The orderly, disciplined world of Fort McCoy, which had once seemed so alien, now felt like a bastion of sanity. The system that had fed and clothed her as a prisoner was the same one that had uncovered this unimaginable evil. The system she had served, the one whose collapse had been marked by paranoid officers and senseless executions, was the one that had perpetrated it. The comparison was no longer just about food or clean barracks. It was a moral reckoning. The phrase Ilsa had spoken, "They treat us better than our officers did," took on a new, horrifying depth. It was not just about the chaos of the final days. It was a condemnation of the entire rotten foundation of the Third Reich. A system that devours its own, that starves its soldiers, and murders millions in secret, is not a system of discipline. It is a system of organized madness. The American discipline, so baffling at first, was the discipline of law, of logistics, of a code, the Geneva Convention, that they followed not out of kindness, but because it was the rule. And in that adherence to rules, even for their enemies, they had shown more true civilization than the Reich ever had. As the months turned into a year, the women of Fort McCoy waited. They watched the seasons change in the Wisconsin countryside, their past a nightmare, their future a terrifying blank. They were no longer soldiers or auxiliaries of a fallen army. They were survivors, haunted by what they had done, what had been done in their name, and what they had lost. The journey home, when it finally came, would not be an end to their ordeal, but the beginning of a new one, the challenge of rebuilding a life and a soul from the ashes of a world that had been built on a foundation of lies and destroyed by its own inhumanity. The clean barracks and scheduled meals of Fort McCoy would remain in their memories not as a hardship, but as a strange, paradoxical sanctuary where they first began to understand the true nature of the cause they had served and the enemy who had, in the end, shown them a discipline rooted not in fanaticism, but in simple, predictable, and utterly shocking order.